Hello, welcome to the video known as Object Parameters. I'm not actually 100% sure if this is the perfect title for this, but I think it's good enough. And what I'm wanting to talk about with this Object Parameters topic is a solution to a common issue, which is when we have way too many parameters for a function that we're using in our program, which causes confusion and heartache and tears of frustration and sadness. And that's something that we should solve. So in order to kind of motivate this, I'm just going to give us a simple example of what that might look like. I'll be using P5 for this. So I'm going to create a simple little program. Simple little program with a 500 by 500 canvas that everyone knows and loves. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to define a special function. And it's going to be called drawFancyRect. And it's going to be called drawFancyRect because rather than just boring old standard rect, which can only be given like a position and a width and a height, which is pathetic and beneath me, I'm going to have drawFancyRect allow me to give it lots of different parameters. So it's going to be able to get the position, because that makes sense, and the width and the height, because that also makes sense, and the red, the green, and the blue of the fill of my rectangle, and the rect mode of my rectangle. So those are all of the parameters that I'm going to use, right? And then to use those, it's roughly what you might expect. Sorry, fill with the RGB properties, set the rect mode to whatever they give us for the mode, and draw a rectangle at the provided x, y, width, and height, and then pop. So that's how drawFancyRect is going to work. So you can see it's quite a few parameters here. It's still fairly legible. It would be even more legible if I expanded things like W and H and R and G and B. But for now, we won't worry about that. You know, it's already got, what is this, 8 different parameters. It's quite a few parameters. And so this is a bit confusing already, but it's not terrible. What is confusing and terrible is when we actually use it, right? So if I say drawFancyRect and I want to draw my actual rectangle, I'm going to draw it at 250, 250, which is the center of the canvas. It's going to be 200 wide and 200 high. It's going to have an RGB of, the red's going to be 255, then green's going to be 255, then the blue's going to be 0, so that would be yellow, and its mode is going to be center. Okay? Now, this is where the problem really starts to kind of rear its head, because this is pretty unintelligible. That's very difficult to read. In part, it's difficult to read, obviously, because all of these are hard-coded numbers and I'm not using variables, but a big part of this is just like, it's a bit difficult to tell which parameter is which here, like which argument is going into which parameter, unless I memorize this list of 8 things, which is difficult. It was easy enough to do right now because I can literally see the definition of the function just under where I was typing. But you know, and I know that in a large program, you can't always see the function definition. And that can be kind of painful because you look at this line of code and you just don't really know. Say I wanted to change the color, it's hard for me to know which of these numbers I should change. I know it's these 3, but it's hard. You can't tell but just by looking at it. So that's the problem, right? When we have lots of parameters in a function, we have an issue. And so a great solution to this, which I have talked about previously in Creative Computation 1, I think, is that instead of having a whole bunch of parameters, we have one parameter. And so what we would do is here we would have like, we'll call it config. A single parameter is going to come into drawFancyRect, and that parameter is going to be an object that contains properties for each of the different things. So x is going to be 250, y is going to be 250, width is going to be, what was it going to be, 200. And actually, I don't really need to call it W anymore because I'm not worried about conflicting with P5's, good grief, P5's width and height, because this is inside an object, so that's not going to cause me any trouble. And I can even do nice things like I can have a fill color, but I can put that inside a separate object as well. So that can have a red, a green, and a blue. And then the final thing was the mode, which is going to be center, right? And that's quite nice. And then I can pass all of that information in. So instead of this big list of unintelligible things, I pass through my config object. And the wonderful thing here is that I can read all of the things I'm asking this rectangle to look like, X, Y, width, height, fill color, mode, etc. I can just see them because they are literally named as properties of this object. And then to use these, the config object is passed through to drawFancyRect, and then I just need to make sure that I'm accessing those properties correctly. So I know that the red, for example, is in config, which is the parameter, dot fill color dot r, right? Same thing for G and B, fill color dot G and fill color dot B. And same thing for mode, that would be config dot mode, because it's inside the object, and same for all of these, right? And this is the moment where I feel smug and I use the multiple cursors thing. Remember that that is using the command key on a Mac, and I'm currently kind of forgetting what it is on Windows. So if you're on Windows, look for multiple cursors in Atom, and I'll try and remember what it is for another video. So config.x, config.y, config. Oh, I made a mistake there as well, right? Width and config.height. Okay, so it's the same code, and if we go over and run this, which I realize I forgot to do in the previous example, so it might not work, and it doesn't. Let's go and look at the error. Fill color is not defined on JavaScript line 27. Why is that? Because it's a config.fill color. That was silly of me. Look at that, live, perfect, real error by Pippin while he's trying to look like a professional. There we go, yellow square in the center of the canvas. That's what it was meant to do. That's what it did do in its previous incarnation as well. It was such a basic idea, I guess, that I didn't show you. I apologize. So drawFancyRect is now a lot easier to understand here, right? We create an object with all of the appropriate properties. We give that object to drawFancyRect, which then uses them appropriately to draw the rectangle. And now this part of my program is super legible. It's very easy to understand what configuration I am setting drawFancyRect up with. So this is wonderful. The problem, if there is one, is that now the function definition for drawFancyRect is harder to read, right? Now it says it only accepts a single parameter, the config object, but I can't tell what properties are meant to be in the config object just by looking at the function signature, is what we call this initial part of a function definition. It doesn't tell me what it's expecting, and I would have to actually read the code of the function to see that it wants a fill color, which has an RGB, and it wants a mode, and it wants an X and a Y and a width and a height. You know, like I have to actually read through that in order to understand what's going on. So the other thing that we can do here, which is a good thing, I think, and this is a pattern of programming I think it's worth getting used to and really using, is we can do this thing called object destructuring. Now, the idea of object destructuring sounds really radical and kind of like almost destructive, I guess, instead of destructurative, or whatever the correct adjective would be there. But it's not. It's just a simple little piece of syntax that can make our program better. So what object destructuring allows us to do is this. We know that the config parameter here is an object. We know that what's going to be passed through is going to be an object with all of these properties. Rather than write in a parameter name here so that that object is stored inside this variable, we can instead destructure that object, break it down into variables, one for each of its properties. And the way that we do that is we write curly brackets, which kind of makes sense for an object-related task. And then we can just list the property names that we're expecting. So X is a property, Y is a property, width is a property, height is a property, fill color is a property. We know that that has an object inside it with RGB, and mode is a property, right? So what this does is when the object comes in, it gets broken apart into variables called X, Y, width, height, fill color, and mode, which we can then use. So the other great thing about this is we don't need the word config anywhere, right? Because we don't have a simple config object that we have to look inside in order to access these properties. Now all of those properties have been turned into variables inside our function. So we get an object created here, which makes it nice and easy to read what is going to be sent to drawFancyRect. So it's very legible over here. The function signature is now legible too because it gives us a list of the properties that it expects to come through in the object that we pass. It's going to have a property x, y, width, height, fill color, and mode. That's nice and easy to read. And the resulting code inside the function is easier to read because we don't have to write config dot in front of everything. We just treat them like regular parameters because that's literally what they are. Just as a proof of concept, of course, let's make sure we look at the program and we see that it still works, right? So all of that kind of fanciness that we're doing yields the same program. This is a classic refrain, right, in programming, is that there are things that we do in our code that are not about changing the program or doing something amazing with our program. Rather, they are about making the code itself more legible, easier for us to read, easier for other people to read, easier to fix and debug and so forth, right? So I would strenuously argue that what we have here is a much more beautiful program, much easier to read and work with than it was before, thanks to A, using an object to pass through properties that define the parameters effectively of what we want to do in our function, passing that object through to the function, and then destructuring the object here in the function's parameters to break the object apart again into its individual properties that we can then use in the normal way inside the function. So that's a pattern, right? It's a pattern. It doesn't change your program, but I think it's a better way to program when you have larger numbers of parameters in your functions. You don't always have to use it. If there's just obviously if there's just one parameter or two or three, not necessarily. When you have more, this is a really interesting way to go, okay? The other good thing about this is that you get to tell your friends and family that you use object destructuring all the time and sounds super cool and like you know what's going on. I try to use it as much as I can when I remember to use it. I think it's really neat and we should all practice using it for this course, okay? And that's it. That's what using object parameters is like, especially with the addition of object destructuring to make it even cooler and more awesome. See you in the next video.